Welcome to part 3 of building the David clock. This is axle fitting. We're going to start with the fiber rod that we used as in the jig assembly, and just pop the guide out of the carrier. This guide's important. Don't lose it. We're going to be using this a lot over the next couple of hours. So we're going to use marking A1 on the guide to cut an axle for the first gear here. So notch it a little bit first, just to indicate where we're going to cut it. Make it just a little bit long, and then we'll saw all the way through. It's very important in this step to make sure that the length of the axle is 100% accurate. We're going to be basing where the axle spacers are placed and where the gears are spaced on the length of this axle. So if this is out, the fitting of the gears will be out, and you may not have proper meshing of the parts of the clock later. So cut it just a little bit long, and then use a piece of sandpaper. And I usually set aside a piece of sandpaper for only this purpose. So once I've used it for carbon fiber, I won't use it for anything else. Otherwise, it gets black markings onto the wood. So we're just going to carefully work each end of the cut axle down until the length is absolutely perfect. So just a little bit more to go here. And make sure they're nice and square and exactly at the correct length. I think we're getting close here. Yep. So take as much time as you need, be very exact, and it's a good idea to just wipe your hands off and dust off your equipment before you continue, just so that you don't get the carbon fiber dust in your lungs or on the parts. So we'll grab a couple of axle spacers. We need 2 for the pallets. And I'm just going to clean these up a little bit, take any rough edges off of them, smooth the face that's going to be touching the bearings, just to reduce friction wherever we can do. And I'm using 220 grit sandpaper here. So first I do each of the faces, and then I just sort of work around the edge, and where the face meets the side, just round that off a little bit, just to make sure nothing's going to catch. And I'll do that for both of the axle spacers. There's going to be one at the top and one at the bottom of the axle. All right, so we're going to use the mark at the end of the axle fitting, and just dry fit everything first, press it in place, make sure it's accurate, and then just move it out of the way a little bit. I'm using crazy glue or CA glue here. Be careful with it. Use it sparingly, and whatever you do, don't glue your hands to the table. So just making sure we have a little bit of a flow. I use Lepage's. It's a little bit thicker. It doesn't run everywhere, and it tends to go where I want it to go. But there's a bunch of brands out there. There's hobby brands, and there's Gorilla has one. So it's really important to make sure that the fitting is exact here. So once you've got one done, the next step is to actually fit the pallets onto that axle. So normally I'd leave a little bit of time for the glue to dry, but we're just going to move along here. So the orientation is very important. So you have to make sure it gets put on the correct way. And each of the stacks that we did for the pallets and each of the wheels has a marking on it. And that marking corresponds to both the frame and it corresponds to the guide. So we're going to use a notch in the guide that corresponds to the pallet, which is kind of a half moon shape, and make sure that it's fit exactly. So that length is very important. And once it's on there, it's not going to move again, so make sure you get it right the first time. So we'll just place the second axle spacer on, and the side that I smoothed goes to the outside. That's the side that's going to touch the bearing and potentially cause some friction. So we've got it in place, move it out of the way a little bit, and just apply a little bead of glue. Then set it in place with the guide, and you want to make sure that everything is nice and square on the axle and fit to the correct depth. And once you've done this, it's not a bad idea to actually place it into the clock and check. And I'll show you how to do that. We'll just tidy up the work area a bit here. I'm going to pop the front face off of the clock. And over the course of building the clock, you'll be doing this quite a bit. So place the pallets onto the matching marking on the base plate. Fit the front plate back. And you need to do a little bit of wiggling to get the axle to slide into the front bearing. But once that's done, the face pops right down. And then you can just check how the alignment of the pallets looks. So you can see here that there's not excessive space at the top and the bottom. If there is, that's an indication that you may have glued the parts on wrong. And you can see the part moves quite smoothly. So it's a good idea to check each of the gears as you go. So we're just going to disassemble that and move on to the next step. So next is the escape wheel. So again, we're going to use marking A1 on the guide. We're going to cut that to length. I'm using just a standard razor saw here. And sometimes you'll notice there's some strands off the end of the tube when you cut it. You can just trim those off. So again, we're going to make sure we get the length 100% correct. So do a little check here, it needs a little bit more. A couple of axle spacers. Again, we need 2 axle spacers for the escape wheel, and we're just going to clean those up a little bit. Make sure that there's no burrs or sharp edges or little hangers of wood fiber, and smooth the edge so that it runs smoothly on the bearing. And we'll do that for each one of them. All right. Now we'll fit the bottom axle spacer onto the axle. Again, we're going to use the end mark in the guide, the one with the octagon or the stop sign. Get it into place, adjust it a little bit, apply some glue. And again, you want to get enough glue so that it forms a good bond, but not so much that it's running everywhere. And you'll sort of get the feel for how much glue to use. And here it is, it's nicely snugged up. Quite accurate there. And now we're going to fit the escape wheel. So again, you want to make sure that the pinion is up. And we're going to use the marking for the escape wheel, which looks like a bow tie. Get the depth accurate. And you want to make sure for each one of these that you're being quite accurate and you're using the right notch. Otherwise, the clock simply won't work. You can fix it later, but it's a lot more work. So here we're making sure that the depth is accurate. That's placed on, and now we just place the top or front axle spacer onto the escape wheel assembly. So we're going to pop it on. Move it into place, make sure it fits correctly. And now we can add the glue and finish the assembly. And here we go, just press that into place. It's kind of hard to show accurately here, but again, you want to make sure that it's set and it's square to the axle and it's at the correct depth, so it's fully inserted into the octagon or stop notch. All right, so we're on to the next one. Again, a couple of axle spacers. We're going to use the A1 marking on the guide. And you can use a miter box to cut this, or you can cut it up against a stop block. Whatever works easiest for you. All right, so we're just going to double check the length. So we're very close on this one. Again, in each case I try to cut it just a little bit long and then sand it down to the correct length. So we're pretty good there. We'll sand our axle spacers, again, just any burrs or loose edges, threads hanging off of them. Smooth the edge, it's called breaking the edge. Just makes sure that there's no sharp edges, nothing that's going to catch. All right, that looks pretty good. So grab the axle spacer, put the lower spacer on. Use that octagon notch to make sure that it's at the right spot. Move it out of the way, apply the glue. Excellent. So next we'll place on the gear assembly, and again the pinion is going up. And in this case we're going to use a third wheel marking, looks like a little clover. Once it's in place, we can apply the glue and slide it back down using the guide. Always use the guide and always make sure it's fully inserted into the appropriate notch. And you want to just double check that everything's square and even. And now we can put the final axle spacer on the third wheel. And again, each time you want to put the broken edge on the outside facing the bearing that it's going to touch. So it starts to get a little bit trickier to get the glue into the right spot here, but again, make sure that you're not applying glue to the gear teeth, that you're only putting it on the axle, and that there's it doesn't drip anywhere. So again, making sure it's fully inserted into the notch and everything's nice and square. All right, so that one's done. We'll move on to the next one. So next is the second wheel. So again, we're going to cut using the A1 notch, score it, cut it, so that one's done. Now we can move on to the second wheel. So again, we're going to use the A1 notch, score it, and cut it to length. I actually cut it a little bit short, so I'm actually going to set that part aside. I'll use that for one of the different axles, shorter axles later. and I'm going to move on and just cut a new piece. It's so important to get the axle lengths right. If you mess up, like I said, you can save it and use it for either the pulley or the minute hand, but cut one that's the right length, just a little bit long. There's a little bit of extra rod there to use in case you do make one error. Just be careful, and getting the length right is the most important. If you really mess things up and you need a new replacement rod, those are available as well. We can ship one out to you. Typically we do that at cost, and the cost of the shipping. So it's, if you want a working clock and you do mess it up, don't panic. There is replacement parts available. So again, the second wheel only has one axle spacer. So it's the lower axle spacer. It goes towards the back of the clock. Again, you're going to use the octagonal notch and glue it just like we did with the rest of the axles. There we go, and we're going to set that one, make sure it's accurate. And then we'll place the actual second gear and pinion on. So this one actually does not have an axle spacer in front of it. It is tucked right up under the front frame of the clock. So it goes directly without a spacer to the second gear mark. So I'm just going to move that out of the way, apply a little bit of glue. And you should be able to get a sense of how much glue I'm using. I'm trying to do a very light bead all the way around the axle, and then press the gear into that bead so that it forms a little bit of a fillet. And I haven't had one of the gears come loose yet. Using this method, it seems to work quite well. All right, so that's the second gear. Once we're done that, we can move on to the great wheel. I always wind up getting a little bit of crazy glue or CA glue on my fingers when I do this. So again, we're going to cut another axle to the A1 length. A sharp razor saw makes your life a lot easier. And again, if there's any strands or threads that are left on the carbon fiber when you're done, just trim them off. So here we go, checking the length, sanding it down. And now we can start the assembly. Just clean up those axle spacers first. Break the edges on them. And we'll press the rear one onto the axle next. Go. We're going to use the octagonal or stop notch. Apply the bead of glue. And then press it into place. Again, each one of these end spacers you want to make sure is nice and square to the axle and nice and smooth. All right, so now we take the great wheel. And the great wheel is a little bit different from the other ones. It goes pinion side down. So there's a notch for it. It's a triangle notch. Apply your bead of glue. And set it to the correct depth. This axle fitting is really important because it orients each of the gears to the gears next to it. So those depths are really important. The great wheel needs an axle spacer on the front, but it needs to be thinned to about half the thickness of the axle spacer. So you can see here that there's a little bit of a gap between the end of the guide and the gear. So you're just going to thin down the axle spacer until it fits completely into the notch. The axle fits completely into the notch. And like I said, it's about half. So it goes pretty quick with a piece of plywood, or with a piece of sandpaper. If you sandwich it between two pieces of sandpaper, it goes even a bit quicker, but it's such a small part, it doesn't take long to thin it out. And I think I'm using 150 grit sandpaper here for the thinning part. And you can see it's already thinned down. Test it as you go. You don't want to get it too thin. You want to make sure it's set just right. So I'm going to go just a little bit more. Remove just a little bit more material from each face. And once I'm comfortable that it's correctly set, I'll apply a little bit of glue and press it into place. Perfect. So the great wheel is now done. Everything's set and nice and tight. And we can move on to the winder wheel. So the winder wheel again, we're going to cut an axle using the A1 notch. Score it, then cut all the way through, just like we did with the other ones. Sometimes it's kind of hard to find the notch on the carbon fiber, but again, make sure you're cutting it just a little bit long and then sand it to length. This is where a miter box comes in handy. Or, like I said, you can just use a block of wood, and that helps as well. And you can see we've got a couple of strands here. You can just remove those. And now we're going to check the length. Sand it down to the correct length. It helps square up the ends too, which helps to make sure that you're getting the length exactly accurate, and that when you press the axle spacers on, that they're at the right depth. All right, so that's looking pretty good. So the procedure for the winder wheel is a little bit different from the other ones. So first we're going to place the winder on. So it's the star symbol. Press it on all the way, and you're going to apply the glue from the front this time. And that's important because you don't want to get any glue inside the actual ratchet assembly and onto the pawls, because that if the pawls don't work, it can cause your whole clock not to work. So here we're just going to press it after placing the glue in front of the gear. Press it all the way on. And that's set. Pop out an axle spacer. And we'll install the front or top axle spacer first. So we're just going to clean it up, remove any rough edges on it. And then we can press it into place. So it's going to be set again with the octagonal or stop notch. Once the depth's correct, apply a little bead of glue. And use the guide to set it. Again, we're making sure everything's nice and square and even all the way around. And now we can pop the ratchet into place, the ratchet and the spool. So what's really important here is before you assemble everything, make sure each of the pawls is fully retracted and oriented correctly. Then you can drop the ratchet on. And this can take a little bit of doing, but it's really important to get this step correctly, because once this is assembled, you can't get back into it. So make sure that it's correctly assembled, make sure that it mates exactly, that it's smooth all the way around, and you should be able to turn only in one direction. So as you turn the other direction, it catches, but you can turn freely in one direction. So that allows you to rewind the clock without having to move all of the gears. And so what we're going to do now is place a final spacer on the back, and that's going to capture the ratchet and spool onto the shaft. So this is a little bit tricky. You have to be a little bit careful with the glue here, because you don't want any glue to touch the spool. So you can only get glue between this axle spacer and the axle, and none, absolutely none, can get onto the spool. So make sure that everything's fitting perfect, and then you can apply the glue. So again, the broken edge goes to the bearing side. There should be just a little bit of play so that the spool can turn, but not so much that it's loose. And again, make sure that everything is accurately assembled here. If you have any doubts, stop, double check, and reassemble it. You'll know when it's correct because everything will sit flat and all of the pawls will move freely. So just a couple of drops of glue here to make sure that there's none squeezing out onto the spool. And then you can press the axle spacer on and use the guide. And it's a good idea just to give that spool a little bit of a turn to make sure that it's not got any glue on it and it's not being caught, and that it's working exactly as it's expected to do. once the glue sets, it's set for good. So there we go. We've got a working winder wheel. So next we go on to the minute hand. This is where it's a little bit different. We're going to use the A2 notch. And here I'm just, I'm reworking that piece that I cut too short earlier. So I'm just going to reuse that short piece and just cut the end off to get it to the A2 length. And just like all the other axles, it's really important to get the length accurate. So I'm going to sand that down to the correct length. And try to keep the ends as square as possible here. So I'm just going to tidy up the ends a little bit. There we go. I think we're pretty accurate. So now we'll grab an axle spacer and we'll clean that one up as well. Just give a little bit of sand to remove any rough edges, break the edges on one side. And now we can fit it to the axle. So in this case, a little bit different. We're going to use the X notch. Move it out of the way, apply the glue. Make sure it's even all the way around. All right. So next we're going to grab that the minute axle. It's a 4mm carbon fiber rod, and that's going to be inserted into the bottom side of the minute axle there. So you want to insert it all the way, and you want to make sure that the front edge is even with the front edge of the tube. So it's really important that it goes in the right way. So you're placing the short end of the tube with the fitting, and you're going to make sure that the rod goes all the way in. All right. So next we're going to work on the pinion here. And that's, again, we're going to clean that up with some sandpaper. We're just going to remove any of the laser residue, any sharp edges, any leftover pieces, and just smooth things out again. There could be some machine marks there. Just removing that off the gear now before you've glued it makes your life a little bit easier later on. So smooth out all the edges. And this gear, it's not critical which way it goes on. It's identical both ways, so you don't have to worry about that. Quick tidy up on this axle spacer. And breaking the edge here. Now we're going to sandwich essentially that pinion onto the shaft between two of the axle spacers. So press the pinion in place. And again, this is glued in place. Next, we're going to glue an axle spacer on top of that. And this provides the correct spacing in the gear, the hands drivetrain, between the hour hand and the minute hand. So those two parts are both glued to the axle. You can remove any residue that's on there, make sure that it's a nice smooth axle. Because next we're going to fit the hour hand onto the minute axle. So the hour hand actually spins smoothly on that axle. It's not glued to it, it just rotates on it independently of the axle. So we want to make sure that it does so with as little friction as possible. So what we're going to do is we're just going to clean up the hole on that shaft assembly. So fold the sandpaper a couple of times. I'm using 1 or 220 grit here, and just work it around. Remove any rough edges, smooth it out, open it up a little bit. You don't want it to be wobbly, but you don't want it to be tight or catching anywhere. So just work any rough edges off. Spinning it's one way, rubbing in back and forth is another. Once you get all the residue off and all the rough edges off, that's the important part. So the final step is to apply some graphite. So we're going to use the pencil and just apply graphite to the inside of that hole. And this is just a lubricant for the wood. It allows it to slide a little bit easier and reduces the friction. And again, friction is your enemy anywhere in the clock. That's what's going to keep the clock from running. So if you can get everything matched correctly and you can get as little friction as possible, the clock tends to like to run. All right, so we've got the layer of graphite in there. And we're just going to do a quick test fit here and make sure that it spins nicely. So that's great. So now we want to capture the hour hand onto the minute axle. So again, we're never gluing the hour hand onto that axle. It's always got to spin freely, but what we're going to do is we're going to place another axle spacer onto the shaft to basically hold that in place as a retainer. So we'll clean it up quickly. And then press it on. So pressing it on here, you want to leave about the thickness of a piece of paper between that axle spacer and the hour hand. Just enough so that it's not dragging on the hour hand, it's not keeping the hour hand from turning, but it's not allowing the hour hand to wobble either. So once you're comfortable with that, it's time to put the minute hand on. So the minute hand is actually glued onto the shaft. So the hour hand spins freely, the minute hand is glued onto the shaft. So we're just double checking that there's not too much wobble. We're trying to get that set just correctly. And you'll get a pretty good sense of this when you're spinning it. And again, it's really important at all stages just to take your time and make sure that you're getting it right. So now we're going to glue on the minute hand. So I'll pop it out of the retainer. And if you want a little bit more contrast on the face of the clock, you can actually paint both of these black. Just clean up any loose pieces on there. And press it into place. So this is going to be pressed right up against that other axle spacer. Try not to move it. And you want to make sure after they're assembled that at no time does the hour hand hit the minute hand. So it still spins freely and it's not going to hit the minute hand. And there. I think we're ready to move on to the next step. So next we're going to assemble the idler. So this is part of the gear train that slows the minute hand down to turn the hour hand once per hour. So here we're going to use the A3 notch. We're just going to score that. Find the notch. There it is. All right, and trim it to length. All right, and again, we're just going to trim off any of those little strands. And make sure we've got the length 100% accurate. So we're close. Just tidy up the ends a little bit. And again, feel free after each one of these steps to install the individual parts into the clock and make sure that they're spinning freely and that there's not too much interplay on them. So we're going to install an axle spacer. Just clean that up a little bit. And we're going to use the O notch. Now the nice thing about the O notch is that that should locate the axle spacer exactly in the center of the shaft. So it doesn't matter which side you put it on. It's almost exactly in the middle of the of that axle. So now we're going to do with the idler gear pretty much exactly what we did with the hour hand. We're going to fit it to the axle, and I just noticed here that it's not quite square. I'm just going to tidy that up a little bit before the glue sets. And we're going to make sure that that idler hand, you can see it's quite tight here. So I'm just going to sand open that that shaft. the shaft hole. So here we're just opening up the hole a little bit, smoothing it with some sandpaper. You can twist it, you can run it in and out, and basically remove any residue that's in the hole, any sharp edges that are in the hole, any machine marks, any unevenness, just to make sure that that gear runs without any friction at all, or as little as possible. And it really doesn't take much time. It takes a few minutes to do each one of these holes, and it can make the difference between the clock running and the clock not running. So it's really worth your time at each one of these steps, just to take a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra care, and make sure that, that you're sanding and cleaning up the parts. So again, we're checking here to make sure that it's spinning smoothly without stopping suddenly, and then we're going to apply the graphite again to the hole. Now, the tricky thing about the idler gear is when it's assembled to the shaft, it has to, the hour hand has to clear the shaft. So it's got to be a little bit shorter, and you have to sand the end of the shaft down after you've actually installed the axle spacer and have it captured. So we'll step you through that in a minute. Just doing a bit of cleanup, remove some of the pencil marks. Doesn't matter which side of the shaft you put it on, because it's in the center. And when you're comfortable that it's spinning nice and smoothly, you can retain it with an axle spacer. So same drill with the axle spacer. We're going to sand it, break the edges, and prepare it. So here it's similar to the hour hand in that you want it to be pressed on far enough so that there's no wobble, but not too far so that it's causing friction. So you want the idler to be able to spin nice and smoothly. And here you're going very sparingly with the glue. It's a little like the spool in that you don't want any of that glue to get onto the pinion. You only want it to bond the axle spacer to the end of the shaft to retain that hour idler. So the hour idler is not glued to the shaft; it spins freely. And once that glue is set, what we're going to do is we're just going to sand down the front face of that, so to make sure that it never touches the hour hand or prevents the hour hand from turning, because again, that's going to stop your clock. And it's a lot easier to do this now while it's out of the clock and you have some control over the parts. Alright, that's pretty good. Now you can see that the graphite is black and the retainer. You can clean that up with a little bit of sandpaper. It's more important to make sure that the idler is running smoothly. And again, I'm just trying to remove a little bit of the graphite from the retainer just so it looks nice and bright. Alright, so with that idler done, there's only one more axle to fit, and that's the pulley axle. So we'll get on to that next. So again, this one's going to be cut using the A3 notch. It's always good to double check which one you're using. So we're going to cut it a little bit long. So we needed to trim this down a little bit in length. And this is one of the few where the length isn't quite as critical. This is going to be the axle for the pulley in the counterweight. So when we've got the length accurate here, we'll grab the pulley. And we're going to use a little counterweight symbol as the guide. And it should center that shaft on the pulley. So we're just going to press that into place. I just wiped away the excess there with my finger. Not really a great idea because that's how you glue your fingers together, but I got away with it. So we've assembled all of the axles to the individual wheels. And the next step is to start matching them together and making sure that they mesh smoothly and with as little friction as possible. But you start to feel a real sense of progress here, and you can sort of see the clock starting to come together. So the next step, we'll get those meshing done. And this took me about a little over 2 hours to get all this done. Total time in is around 5 hours at this point.